From today, I don't want to see you in my house again.
What have I done to deserve this kind of inhuman treatment from you?
Unaware his wife secretly inherited $2.5 billion and banks, the husband beat and chased her away. He raised his hand, not knowing he was striking a billionaire. To him, she was just a quiet, unlucky wife who never brought money home. The woman he insulted, beat, and chased out of his house like she was nothing. What he didn't know, what no one had told him, was that days earlier, her name had been read aloud in a sealed room. As the sole heir to $2.5 billion in cash, properties, and banks. She never bragged. She never warned him. She thought love was safer than wealth. But the night he dragged her outside and locked the gate behind her, something irreversible happened. Because this wasn't just a marriage breaking. It was a man destroying the one person who could have saved him or ended him. And when the truth finally surfaced, he would realize too late. He didn't chase away a weak woman. He chased away power. Welcome to Ocean of Tales. Kindly watch, comment, and subscribe on this channel. We will be grateful if you help us do this. We will be notifying you when we drop a new video. Don't forget to tell us where you are watching from. Before we move to the main story, if today is your first time of watching our video, please subscribe. The sound of skin meeting skin cracked through the Lagos living room like a snapped plank, sharp and final, cutting through the hum of the ceiling fan and the distant traffic outside the estate. Dust lifted from the tiled floor as if the house itself flinched. For a split second, everything froze, air, breath, thought, before reality rushed back in waves. Her body staggered sideways, crashing into the arm of the sofa, glass rattling on the center table. The moment wasn't loud because of the slap, it was loud because of what it destroyed. And as his hand hovered in the air, something irreversible had already begun to move. She pressed her palm to her cheek, heat spreading fast, eyes wide with disbelief rather than pain, as if her mind was still trying to confirm what her body already knew. The room smelled faintly of fried onions from dinner that was never finished, a cruel reminder of normalcy seconds earlier. His chest rose and fell hard, anger still pacing inside him like a trapped animal that didn't know it had already crossed a line. This wasn't the first time his temper had flashed. But this time felt different, heavier, like the floor beneath them had shifted. And neither of them understood, yet why the air suddenly felt unforgiving. He stood there, Kunle Adeyemi, mid-30s, logistics contractor hustling routes between Lagos and Port Harcourt, shoulders squared like a man used to being obeyed. He had grown up watching men shout to be heard, strike to be feared, and apologize later if necessary. Control was the language he knew best. In his mind, this moment would pass like others: anger, silence, normalcy. He believed power always returned to its owner. But as he watched her steady herself without crying, something unfamiliar crept into his gut, a quiet resistance that didn't look like fear. And that unsettled him more than defiance ever could. She straightened slowly, fingers trembling, shoulders tight, as if holding herself together by muscle memory alone. Amara Adeyemi. Soft-spoken, early 30s, former NGO admin assistant turned full-time wife, had learned long ago how to absorb impact without making noise. Raised in Enugu by a widowed aunt who taught her endurance over confrontation, she had mastered the art of shrinking to survive. Her eyes didn't harden or plead. They withdrew, retreating somewhere deeper than the room. That withdrawal, quiet and complete, was the most dangerous thing in that space, and no one noticed it yet. The ceiling fan continued its lazy rotation, uncaring, while the silence stretched longer than comfort allowed. His anger began to cool, replaced by something sharper: entitlement. He stepped closer, crowding her space, asserting presence like a reminder of ownership. She didn't step back this time. She didn't step forward either. She simply stood still, spine straight, breath measured, as if drawing an invisible line between them. That line wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was the first boundary she had ever drawn, and it shook something loose inside him that he couldn't name. Outside, a generator kicked on somewhere down the street, its low growl bleeding into the room, mirroring the tension humming between them. His mind raced ahead, justifications forming, excuses rehearsing themselves automatically. Her mind did the opposite. It went quiet, clearing space for something colder than fear. This wasn't shock anymore. It was recognition. Recognition that whatever held this marriage together had finally snapped. And while he still believed this night would end like all the others, she felt something settle inside her chest that had never been there before. She turned her face slightly away, not in submission, but in decision, as if memorizing the room one last time. The curtains, the cracked wall clock, the life she had been shrinking to fit inside. His hand dropped to his side, convinced the storm had passed. But storms don't always roar when they change direction. Sometimes they go silent first. And as the house breathed around them, one truth hovered unspoken in the air. This strike hadn't ended the fight. It had started a chain reaction that would tear far beyond this room. Rainwater slid down the cracked gutter of a small Enugu compound, dripping into a rusty paint bucket with a steady, mocking rhythm, as Amara knelt to scrub a school uniform that wasn't even hers. The air smelled of damp cement and detergent, and the courtyard echoed with other people's laughter. Light, careless, untouched by worry. She was still a teenager then, skinny arms working like she could wash bad luck out of fabric. Neighbors watched her like a story that never improved, whispering that misfortune followed her like a shadow. She kept scrubbing anyway, because in her world, survival didn't reward noise. A funeral bell once rang too early in her life, and after that, everything felt like it was borrowed time. She grew up under her widowed aunt's roof, where food was measured, kindness was rationed, and affection came only after chores were completed perfectly. Her parents' absence wasn't just grief, it was a permanent gap that people used to explain away anything that went wrong around her. If a business failed, they blamed her presence. If a child fell sick, they blamed her spirit. She learned to swallow pain before it showed on her face, but each swallow left something bitter behind. Market mornings in Enugu were loud, hot, and unforgiving, with pepper-red dust rising under slippers and the sharp scent of smoked fish clinging to the air. Amara would pass stalls and feel eyes follow her, not with admiration, but with the curiosity people reserve for someone they think is cursed. Women leaned close to each other, murmuring that she was too quiet, too plain, too unfortunate. Men looked once, and looked away, as if luck could rub off. She kept her gaze low, moving like a shadow through bright sunlight, because being noticed in that place always came with a price. Bus engines groaned on early mornings as she traveled to her first real job in Lagos, sitting by the window with her bag tight against her chest, watching the city wake up in layers. Yellow Danfo buses, horn blasts, street sellers calling into traffic. She worked as an admin assistant in a small NGO office on the mainland, filing documents, arranging meetings, cleaning up other people's messes, without complaint. She became the kind of worker bosses trusted because she never asked for praise. Yet every time something went wrong, late funding, missing files, a broken printer, eyes drifted toward her like the problem must have her name on it. Bright wedding colors once filled her vision like a promise, Asoebi fabrics, shimmering gelly, the sweet sting of perfume in warm air, as Kunle's family arrived with loud confidence and big smiles. He had looked like a solution then, a man with a steady hustle, a voice that carried authority, a hand that felt protective instead of heavy. People around her called it grace, said maybe her luck had finally turned. Even her aunt softened, as if marriage could wipe away the label she wore. Amara believed it too, because when you've been drowning quietly for years, even a shaky bridge feels like salvation. Cold nights in their Lagos home sometimes felt colder than the harm itself, with the air conditioner humming like a distant warning and the curtains barely moving in the dark. Amara learned to measure her words like money, spending only what wouldn't cost her peace. She smiled when she wanted to cry. She apologized when she wasn't wrong. She absorbed blame like sponge, telling herself it was love, telling herself every marriage had storms. And each time she chose silence, She felt safer for a moment, until she realized safety was becoming the same thing as disappearance, and she was slowly vanishing inside her own life. A phone screen once lit up her face in the middle of the night, blue and cold, as a message flashed from an old contact she hadn't saved with affection, just a name tied to her past. Her fingers hovered over it while Kunle slept, mouth slightly open, peaceful in a way she never was. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and fabric softener, too clean for the tension living inside it. She stared at that message and felt the old, unlucky label tightening around her again, as if fate was about to repeat itself. And when she finally exhaled, one question pressed into her chest. What if she had married her greatest disaster? Morning light crept through the thin curtains of their Lagos apartment, cutting pale lines across the tiled floor as Amara moved quietly from room to room, aligning cushions that didn't need fixing. The house smelled of coffee and detergent, sharp and clean, like a place trying too hard to look peaceful. Kunle sat scrolling through his phone, jaw tight, eyes already annoyed before a word was spoken. Every day began this way, silence stretched thin, waiting for the smallest excuse to snap. Love used to live here once, but now the house breathed caution, as if even the walls knew something dangerous was always one mistake away. Keys clinked against the table as Kunle dropped them deliberately, the sound louder than necessary, a signal more than an accident. He liked order, not the kind that brought calm, but the kind that reminded everyone who decided how things ran. Meals had to be ready on time. Calls had to be answered immediately. Explanations were treated like challenges. Amara adjusted her pace to his moods, reading his body the way sailors read the sky for storms. Each small rule felt harmless on its own, but together they formed a cage, so tight, she didn't realize she was trapped until breathing became work. Outside the house, Kunle wore charm like a tailored jacket. At family gatherings in Abuja and loud weddings in Surulere, his laughter carried, his generosity visible, his confidence admired. People slapped his back and praised Amara for marrying well, for landing a man who looked solid and respected. She smiled beside him, nodding when spoken to, playing her role perfectly. No one saw the switch flip when the doors closed, when the air went cold, and his voice dropped. The contrast was dizzying, two men in one body, and she lived with both, never knowing which would come home. Apologies followed outbursts the way rain followed thunder, predictable and hollow, leaving damage behind. Kunle would pace, calm himself, then act like nothing serious had happened, expecting the world to reset on his timeline. Amara accepted these cycles because resistance only made the storms last longer. Bruises faded. Words echoed longer. Each time she forgave, she felt herself bending a little more, convincing herself this was compromise, that patience was strength. But cruelty, when repeated, doesn't stay shocking. It becomes routine. And routine was the most dangerous thing growing between them. Traffic horns blared outside as Lagos lived loudly beyond their windows, but Amara's world grew smaller by the day. Calls to friends slowed. Visits to family became rare. Kunle always had reasons: too busy, too expensive, unnecessary drama. Slowly, her support system thinned until the house felt like the only place she existed. Isolation wasn't announced. It crept in wearing practicality. And as her connections faded, his voice grew louder in her head, shaping how she saw herself, until even her own thoughts sounded like his criticisms echoing back at her. Late at night, when the city softened and the apartment cooled, Amara would lie awake listening to Kunle's breathing, steady and unbothered, while questions crowded her chest. She remembered the man who once brought food home unasked, who held her hand in public like he was proud. She clung to those memories like receipts proving love had existed. Hope is stubborn like that, it survives on fragments. She told herself change was possible, that endurance would be rewarded. But hope, when misplaced, doesn't save you. It keeps you still while the ground beneath you erodes. One evening, voices rose higher than usual, spilling through open windows into the compound, and Amara realized too late that privacy had left the conversation. Neighbors' movements slowed outside. A generator hummed nearby, steady and watchful. Kunle's anger no longer cared about walls or witnesses. Something about that moment felt exposed, like the truth was pushing toward daylight whether she was ready or not. As she stood there, heart pounding, a terrifying clarity settled in. Control was done hiding. And when control stops pretending to be love, it usually announces itself loudly, in front of everyone. Night fell hard over the Lagos compound, thick with generator fumes and the metallic clatter of closing gates, as raised voices tore through the air like torn fabric. Neighbors paused mid-step, sandals scraping concrete, heads tilting toward the sound with instinctive hunger. Light spilled from the Adeyemi living room into the corridor, harsh and revealing, catching dust in the air like witnesses that couldn't look away. Amara stood near the door, breath shallow, heart beating too loud for her chest. This wasn't an argument anymore, it was a performance. And the audience was already gathering. A sudden shove broke the rhythm, forcing her forward as balance betrayed her, feet skidding on smooth tiles still damp from mopping. The room shifted, furniture blurring as momentum took over, and a sharp sting flared where fingers clamped down, not guiding, not warning, commanding. Kunle's presence crowded her space completely, a wall with nowhere to lean but pain. Objects rattled. A plastic bowl tipped, clattering uselessly. This wasn't rage searching for words, it was a decision made with force. And once force chooses a direction, it rarely stops at mercy. The front door swung open, hinges screaming like they understood what was coming, and cooler night air slapped her skin, raising goosebumps that had nothing to do with temperature. Outside, faces hovered in half-light, curious, cautious, alive with judgment. Someone coughed. Someone whispered. Gravel bit into her feet as she stumbled forward, pulled by momentum she didn't own. The compound felt suddenly enormous, every step stretching time, every sound magnified. Shame burned hotter than fear, because humiliation is weight, and it pressed down on her shoulders with every stare that refused to look away. Balcony doors creaked open above, silhouettes forming like a gallery of shadows, watching without intervention. Phones glowed briefly, then dimmed, recording memories if not footage. No one stepped forward. No one asked questions. This was how communities practiced cruelty, by turning stillness into permission. Amara felt the eyes more than she felt the pain, felt her name dissolving into a story others would tell tomorrow. The compound's floodlight flickered, bathing her in white glare, stripping away privacy entirely. In that light, dignity became the only thing she could still carry. The gate loomed ahead, tall and unforgiving, its iron bars cold even before she touched them. Kunle's grip tightened, urgency sharpening as if the act needed completion to make sense. The latch rattled, metal screaming against metal, and for a moment the world narrowed to that sound alone. When the gate finally swung open, it felt less like an exit and more like exile. She crossed the threshold without protest because some doors close whether you beg or not. And once crossed, they remember you as someone who no longer belongs. The gate slammed shut behind her with a violence that echoed down the street, sealing the night like a verdict. Dust rose from the ground, settling on her clothes, marking her with the city's grime and its indifference. Inside, the house went quiet too quickly, as if erasing her presence had been the goal all along. Outside, the road stretched uncertain and exposed, headlights flashing past without slowing. She stood there, alone, breathing through the shock, realizing that the pain wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how easily life continued without her. She adjusted the strap of her small bag, fingers numb, and took a step into the darkness beyond the gate, the city's noise swallowing her whole. Somewhere far from that compound, paperwork lay stacked neatly, names inked in finality, signatures drying without ceremony. The irony hovered unseen, heavy and patient. As she walked away, shoulders squared against the night, a truth pressed close, waiting its turn to surface. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the moment it split. and the world had no idea what it had just pushed into motion. Morning broke quietly in Abuja, sunlight gliding across polished marble floors inside a high-rise legal complex where voices never needed to rise to be powerful. Air conditioning hummed softly, carrying the faint scent of paper and expensive cologne as men and women in tailored suits took their seats without ceremony. Outside, the city moved unaware, traffic flowing, vendors calling, life continuing as usual. Inside this room, however, time slowed with intention. Thick files were stacked neatly on a long mahogany table, their weight measured not in pages, but in consequences. This was not a place for emotions, only outcomes. A senior attorney cleared his throat, the sound crisp and controlled, as sealed envelopes were slid forward like sacred objects. Pens aligned, glasses adjusted. Every movement carried quiet authority. These people had witnessed fortunes change hands before, but even they felt the gravity pressing into the room. A will written years earlier, updated carefully, protected fiercely, waited to speak. Outside, sunlight hit the windows just right, reflecting off the glass like a warning flare. Inside, names were about to be called that would redraw maps of ownership, influence, and power. And no one present yet understood how far the ripple would travel. The paper unfolded slowly, deliberately, as if respecting what it was about to reveal. A name was read aloud, clear, unmistakable, final. Amara Adeyemi. The room stilled, pens pausing midair. A junior associate blinked, checking spelling twice. Documents were shuffled, confirmations exchanged in silence. This was no error. She was listed as sole beneficiary, cash reserves, real estate holdings across Lagos and Port Harcourt, controlling interests in 2 regional banks. The number attached to her inheritance carried commas that demanded attention. In that moment, a woman standing alone by a Lagos roadside became something else entirely. The story behind the fortune was old, layered, and carefully guarded. Her biological father, a financier who lived quietly between Nigeria and London, had built an empire without ever announcing it to the world. He watched from a distance, supported anonymously, tested loyalty, without revealing identity. When illness finally claimed him, he left no room for dispute. Blood mattered. Character mattered more. Amara's years of silence, humility, and endurance had unknowingly written her qualification. The irony sat heavy in the room. The same traits that made her vulnerable in marriage had earned her unimaginable power elsewhere. Signatures followed, swift and absolute, ink sealing decisions that could not be reversed. Bank representatives nodded, already calculating transitions. Assets began moving in theory before they ever moved in practice. Phones vibrated softly as instructions queued themselves for execution. Meanwhile, no one in that room knew, or cared, that Amara had slept outside hours earlier, clutching her bag, replaying the sound of a gate slamming shut. 2 worlds existed in parallel, completely unaware of each other. And somewhere between them sat a truth so explosive that timing alone made it cruel. No calls were made to her yet. No announcements leaked. Protocol demanded discretion, preparation, strategy. Wealth this size did not arrive with fanfare, it arrived with silence first. That silence wrapped itself around her unknowingly, even as she navigated Lagos streets with borrowed courage. The power now legally hers waited patiently, like a loaded weapon locked in a drawer. And silence, once again, stood between love and survival. Only this time, it was protecting her, not harming her. The question wasn't if the truth would surface. It was when. As the meeting adjourned and chairs slid back neatly into place, the room released a breath it didn't know it was holding. Outside, Abuja's sunlight carried on indifferent. Far away, Amara boarded a bus without knowing her name now commanded boardrooms and balance sheets. The gap between who she believed she was and what she had become stretched wider with every passing minute. And as the sealed room returned to routine, one certainty settled into place. When this truth finally reached Lagos, it would not ask for forgiveness. It would arrive like judgment. Cold morning air brushed Amara's skin as she sat on a low concrete block near a roadside junction in Surulere, watching buses hiss to a stop and pull away without noticing her. The city smelled of fuel, dust, and baked bread from a nearby kiosk, life moving with stubborn indifference. Her phone rested in her palm, dark and silent, heavy with truths she had never spoken. People would later ask why she stayed quiet, why she endured, why she never revealed what could have protected her. But in that moment, the answer felt simple. Love had taught her that silence was safer than honesty. A memory surfaced of her sitting across from Kunle weeks earlier, light from the television flickering across his face as he spoke casually about money with bitterness and pride. She had watched his jaw tighten whenever wealth came up, how insecurity wrapped itself around his words like barbed wire. Amara understood then that money didn't just change circumstances, it exposed fractures. She feared wealth would turn his control into obsession, his anger into entitlement. She believed hiding the truth might protect the fragile piece she was clinging to. That belief, soft and hopeful, blinded her to the cost of staying small. Evenings once ended with her lying still beside him, counting breaths in the dark while the hum of traffic filtered through the window. She replayed moments from earlier years, small kindnesses, half smiles, laughter that felt real enough to remember. Hope fed on those fragments, convincing her that patience could reshape a man. She told herself that endurance was loyalty, that love meant waiting. But hope, when paired with fear, becomes a trap. It keeps you invested in a future that only exists if someone else decides to change, and Kunle never had a reason to. Each unspoken truth strengthened his grip, without him knowing why. Silence allowed him to believe his dominance was natural, unquestioned, deserved. Amara's quiet obedience became evidence, in his mind, that he was right, that force worked. The more she hid, the more he expanded. Her restraint fed his certainty, like fuel poured carefully onto a flame. And while she thought she was protecting love, she was actually teaching him there would be no consequences. That lesson, once learned, became dangerous, because people rarely stop using power when it works. One night, alone in the bathroom, cold tiles biting into her knees, Amara stared at her reflection and barely recognized the woman looking back. Her eyes looked older than her years, weighed down by decisions she kept making for someone else's comfort. She pressed her palms to the sink, grounding herself as a quiet question surfaced. What if silence wasn't love at all? The thought scared her more than the violence, because it meant everything she had sacrificed might have been for nothing. And once that question entered her mind, it refused to leave. The inheritance she didn't yet understand was meant to secure her life, to give her choices, to ensure she would never have to shrink again. Yet the secrecy surrounding it mirrored the secrecy she practiced in marriage, two silences colliding from different worlds. One silence was strategic, the other was survival-based. Together, they created a cruel irony. The very truth that could have protected her arrived wrapped in the same quiet she had used to endure abuse. And as she carried that silence unknowingly, its weight began to shift from burden to shield. She stood up slowly, brushing dust from her clothes as the sun climbed higher, warming her skin with reluctant comfort. Something inside her had moved during the night. Not hope, not fear, but clarity. She didn't yet know who she was about to become, only that the woman who believed silence was safety was gone. The city roared around her, impatient and alive, as if daring her to step forward. And with every breath she took away from that gate, the question sharpened: what happens when a quiet woman finally chooses herself? Sunlight burned through the afternoon haze as Amara stepped off a crowded bus in Yaba, the noise hitting her like a wave. Horns blaring, conductors shouting destinations, engines coughing black smoke into the air. Her legs ached from standing too long, from carrying herself through a city that suddenly felt hostile and vast. The pavement radiated heat through her thin soles, grounding her in the uncomfortable truth that there was no safety net waiting. No one asked where she was going. No one offered help. The world moved on with ruthless efficiency, and she had to move with it or be swallowed whole. Night settled quickly, thick and heavy, as Amara found shelter on the narrow balcony of a closed shop, curling into herself while the city refused to sleep. Neon signs flickered in the distance, and laughter drifted from a nearby bar, cruel in its indifference. The concrete pressed cold against her back, and every passing footstep made her breath hitch. She clutched her bag like a lifeline, listening to the rhythm of strangers' lives continuing uninterrupted. This was what abandonment looked like. Not dramatic, not loud, but quiet and isolating. And the silence dared her to break or adapt. Morning arrived without mercy, dragging her awake with the smell of fried akara and the hiss of hot oil. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, sharp and humiliating, forcing her to confront needs she had learned to suppress. She washed her face at a public tap, flinching at her reflection, dust-streaked, eyes rimmed red, but still standing. Each small action became an act of defiance. Eating, walking, breathing. Pain sharpened her awareness, stripping away illusions. Survival didn't ask for permission or patience. It demanded presence. And slowly, reluctantly, her body answered. She began to notice things she never had before, the patterns of the city, the kindness hidden in unexpected places, the quiet strategies people used to endure. A food vendor slipped her extra bread without comment. A bus driver waved her on when she fumbled for change. These moments didn't erase her suffering, but they anchored her. Strength wasn't loud or dramatic. It was accumulated, piece by piece, in moments that refused to let her disappear. And with each kindness, a question grew louder inside her. What else had she underestimated about herself? Days blurred together as Amara navigated Lagos with growing confidence, learning shortcuts, reading faces, adapting quickly. Fear still walked beside her, but it no longer led. She stopped replaying the gate in her mind and started focusing on the next step, the next decision. Something inside her hardened, not into bitterness, but into resolve. She realized survival wasn't just about staying alive, it was about reclaiming agency. The world hadn't paused for her pain, and that realization stung. But it also freed her. If nothing waited for her, then everything was possible. There was no sudden glow-up, no cinematic rescue. Transformation came quietly in the way her posture changed, in how she met strangers' eyes without flinching. She began to speak when necessary, her voice steady, surprising even herself. The woman who once apologized for existing was fading, replaced by someone who understood boundaries. Loss carved space inside her, and in that space, resilience took root. This growth wasn't pretty or inspirational, it was practical, born from necessity. And necessity, she learned, was a brutal but effective teacher. One afternoon, as she stood beneath a faded billboard advertising luxury apartments she would never consider, her phone vibrated sharply in her hand. An unfamiliar number flashed on the screen, persistent, urgent. She stared at it, heart racing, sensing that whatever waited on the other end would not be small or gentle. The city roared around her, unaware that her life was about to pivot again. She didn't answer immediately. She breathed first, because something told her that the world, which had shown her no mercy, was finally about to reveal its other face. The phone vibrated again in Amara's palm, harder this time, as if insisting on being acknowledged, and the city's noise seemed to dip for a heartbeat when she finally answered. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, wrapped in professional certainty, introducing titles and institutions that sounded too heavy for the cracked pavement beneath her feet. Traffic roared back to life, but her focus narrowed to each carefully chosen word, each pause loaded with meaning. She felt the air thicken around her, sensed that this wasn't charity or coincidence. Whatever this call carried had been moving toward her for years. Documents were mentioned, names confirmed, a meeting requested, not begged, not explained. The speaker's tone carried the confidence of people who do not chase permission. Amara leaned against a bus stop pole, metal warm from the sun, as the magnitude crept in slowly, like water rising behind a dam. Her father's name surfaced. Spoken with respect, not pity, followed by phrases that didn't fit her current reality. Controlling interest, board approval, immediate transfer. The world didn't spin. It steadied. And in that stillness, disbelief fought quietly with instinctive understanding. By evening, screens across Lagos and Abuja flickered with restrained urgency. Financial blogs first, then mainstream outlets, headlines written carefully to avoid panic, but sharp enough to command attention. A reclusive financier's estate finalized. A sole beneficiary confirmed. Analysts speculated. Bank executives canceled dinners. In glass towers, men and women leaned closer to monitors, rereading a name that felt unfamiliar yet unavoidable. Amara Adeyemi. The repetition gave it weight. Somewhere between the scrolling text and the muted television glow, a woman once pushed through a gate became a figure markets now needed to understand. Conference rooms filled with tension as chairs scraped back and whispered instructions bounced off soundproof walls. Legal teams reviewed clauses. Shareholders demanded clarity. Plans were redrawn in real time. Power, once settled, shifted visibly, and it made people uncomfortable. Her absence from these rooms was the loudest presence of all. She wasn't there to reassure anyone. She wasn't there to explain herself. And that uncertainty, that lack of access, unsettled even the most seasoned executives. Authority doesn't always announce itself with a voice. Sometimes it arrives by simply existing, unreachable and undeniable. In Lagos, Kunle felt the change before he understood it, a strange tightening in his chest as his phone buzzed repeatedly, messages stacking faster than he could read. A coworker's call came through, voice strained, asking questions that made no sense. He turned on the television just as the headlines settled into place, bold and unforgiving. The room seemed to tilt as recognition landed, heavy and cold. The woman he had chased into the night was now attached to numbers he couldn't comprehend. Shock drained the color from his face, replaced by something darker, fear wrapped tightly around regret. While Amara sat quietly in a modest room borrowed from a kind stranger, absorbing instructions she barely responded to, Kunle paced his apartment like a trapped animal. His mind replayed moments with cruel clarity, the slap, the gate, the silence she carried. Each memory sharpened now that context had changed. Power had shifted without warning, and it had left him behind. Outside his window, the city carried on, uncaring. Inside, his certainty collapsed. He had believed dominance made him strong. Now, stripped of that illusion, he faced the terrifying truth that he had destroyed the one bridge he would never be allowed to cross again. As night deepened, Amara looked out at the city lights, reflections trembling on the glass like possibilities finally waking up. She hadn't smiled yet. She hadn't celebrated. The truth hadn't made her lighter. It had made her heavier with responsibility and choice. Somewhere else, whispers were spreading fast, recalibrating old judgments. Tomorrow, faces that once looked through her would look for her. And as the headlines continued to circulate, one question hung unanswered in the air. How does a woman rise when the world that broke her is suddenly forced to bow? Morning light spilled into the Lagos compound with the same indifference it always had, but something in the air felt unsettled, like a joke that no longer landed. Neighbors stepped out cautiously, phones already glowing in their hands, scrolling headlines they pretended not to read too closely. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Laughter came out thinner, forced. The same courtyard that once buzzed with gossip now carried a strange restraint, as if everyone sensed the ground beneath their certainty had shifted. A name kept appearing on screens, and with each appearance, confidence drained quietly from familiar faces. Women who once whispered behind their palms now spoke in softer tones, careful with their words, adjusting old stories to fit new realities. The unlucky wife, narrative cracked under the weight of facts no one could argue with. People replayed memories selectively, insisting they had always felt something was wrong, always suspected Kunle's temper, always believed she deserved better. Revisionism moved fast, faster than truth ever had. Amara's absence from the compound became glaring, a missing presence that forced everyone to confront how easily they had accepted her humiliation as entertainment. No one apologized out loud. Shame rarely announces itself that way. It settled instead in avoidance, in eyes that slid away too quickly, in greetings swallowed before leaving mouths. People who had watched her dragged to the gate now avoided standing near it, as if the metal bars remembered. Guilt hovered, uncomfortable and unresolved, because acknowledging her pain meant acknowledging their silence. And silence, once again, became the community's refuge. But this time it wasn't protective. It was accusatory, reminding them that inaction had consequences too. As the scale of her inheritance sank in, mockery transformed into fear with remarkable speed. People wondered aloud what kind of woman she would become with that much power, whether she would remember who watched and who looked away. Speculation replaced laughter. Every rumor carried caution now. Power changes how stories are told, and suddenly, everyone understood that Amara was no longer someone they could discuss carelessly. The same tongues that once cut sharp now measured every word, because fear, unlike gossip, knows when to be quiet. Kunle felt the shift most acutely when familiar faces stopped answering his calls, when conversations ended abruptly, when invitations dried up without explanation. The compound that once affirmed his authority now treated him like a liability. His presence reminded people of a moment they wished they could erase. Isolation wrapped around him the way it once wrapped around Amara, slow and suffocating. The irony burned deep, but irony doesn't heal. It only exposes. And as he stood alone in spaces that used to recognize him, the weight of his actions pressed closer than ever. Meanwhile, Amara existed everywhere and nowhere at once. Her name traveled faster than her body ever had, turning into a symbol people argued about without understanding. Some called her proof that patience pays. Others called her a warning about underestimating quiet people. She hadn't returned to correct anyone. Her absence fueled the mythology, allowing the story to grow beyond her control. And while she focused on stabilizing her new reality, the community wrestled with the discomfort of knowing they had been wrong at the loudest possible moment. As dusk settled, the compound fell unusually quiet, the gate standing closed and unremarkable, yet heavy with memory. Conversations paused whenever footsteps approached, and every glance carried unspoken questions about what accountability might look like next. The laughter that once echoed there was gone, replaced by tension and anticipation. Somewhere beyond their reach, Amara was stepping into rooms that required decisions, not explanations. And as the community waited, uneasy, watchful, one truth became impossible to ignore. Silence had protected them once, but now it was only counting down to consequence. The morning Kunle lost his footing didn't announce itself with sirens or shouting. It arrived quietly, wrapped in unanswered calls and unread messages. Sunlight crept into his Lagos apartment, revealing the same furniture, the same walls, but none of the authority he once felt there. His phone lay face up on the table, stubbornly silent, reflecting a man he barely recognized. Outside, traffic moved with purpose, reminding him that life didn't pause for regret. Something essential had shifted overnight, and as he sat there listening to the ticking wall clock, he felt the first true weight of being alone with his choices. Emails arrived later than usual, cautious and formal, stripping away familiarity he once took for granted. Contracts stalled. Meetings were postponed indefinitely. His name no longer carried certainty, it carried risk. In offices where his voice once commanded attention, it now triggered uncomfortable pauses. People measured their responses, distanced themselves subtly, as if association alone could stain them. Power, he learned, was fragile when built on intimidation instead of respect. And as opportunities slipped through his fingers without confrontation or explanation, Kunle realized the world was punishing him not with violence, but with indifference. Evenings stretched long and hollow as Kunle scrolled through contacts, stopping short of calling anyone. The laughter that once filled his weekends had evaporated, replaced by a ringing silence that pressed against his chest. Friends who used to drop by unannounced now had excuses rehearsed and ready. The compound greeted him with nods instead of warmth, eyes lingering just long enough to judge. He felt watched in a way that offered no validation, only reflection. Isolation wrapped around him like a familiar coat, one he suddenly recognized from the wrong side. Sleep came in fragments, broken by flashes of memory that refused to soften with time. The slap replayed with brutal clarity. The gate echoed louder than it ever had that night. Details he once dismissed now returned sharpened, each one carrying accusation. His mind tried bargaining, context, stress, provocation, but the excuses collapsed under their own weight. For the first time, he saw himself without the armor of justification. And what stared back was not a powerful man pushed too far, but someone who had chosen cruelty because it felt easy. One afternoon, Kunle found himself standing outside a quiet cafe in Abuja, phone trembling slightly in his hand as he typed and deleted the same message repeatedly. Apologies felt thin now, stripped of leverage and timing. He understood too late that regret spoken after consequences isn't repentance, it's fear. The words he wanted to send sounded performative even to him. He imagined her reading them, calm and distant, and the thought tightened his throat. Power had once forced her silence. Now, silence was her choice, and it cut deeper than any response could have. Without dominance to lean on, Kunle struggled to understand who he was. His sense of self had been built on being needed, feared, obeyed. Strip that away, and what remained felt small and exposed. He walked through Lagos streets feeling invisible, unremarkable, just another man swallowed by the city's rhythm. Pride, once his loudest companion, turned inward and became self-contempt. The realization settled slowly and painfully. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the version of himself he pretended was strength. As night settled, Kunle stood by his window watching city lights flicker like distant judgments, each one reminding him of a life he could no longer touch. Regret pressed close, heavy and persistent, but offered no relief. The world hadn't ended for him, it had simply moved him aside. Somewhere beyond his reach, Amara was building something he would never be invited into. And as he finally sat with the full weight of that truth, one question refused to let him rest. What does a man become when the power he abused is gone forever? Morning light washed over a quiet conference room in Victoria Island, soft and deliberate, as Amara stepped inside without ceremony. The glass walls reflected a woman who moved with purpose, not spectacle, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, breath even. Papers lay arranged neatly on the table, the hum of the air conditioning steady like a pulse. This was power entering a room without raising its voice. She didn't scan faces for approval or recognition. She took her seat, fingers resting lightly on the folder before her, knowing the weight inside it didn't need announcement to be felt. Numbers flowed across screens as projections shifted and plans unfolded, each decision forming a quiet architecture of intent. Amara listened more than she spoke, absorbing implications, asking questions that cut to the center, without theatrics. She could have leveraged fear, could have exposed names, could have rewritten old humiliations with interest. The options sat there, obvious and tempting. Instead, she chose direction over drama. Vengeance promised heat, but no shelter. Building promised endurance. And with each measured nod, she set in motion outcomes that would outlast any momentary satisfaction. Strength revealed itself in restraint as she declined proposals that centered her story instead of her strategy. She redirected attention away from the past and toward structures that would stand without her constant presence. Banks stabilized. Jobs were protected. Investments prioritized sustainability over spectacle. The room adjusted to her rhythm, not the other way around. For the first time, she felt the difference between power that demands obedience and power that invites alignment. One exhausts, the other multiplies. And the realization settled into her bones like something she had always known but never been allowed to practice. Later, In the quiet of a private office, the city's noise filtered in as a distant murmur, grounding rather than distracting. Amara stood by the window, watching people move with small urgencies, each carrying lives she would never know. Healing didn't arrive as forgiveness or forgetting. It arrived as distance, enough space to breathe without flinching. She didn't need to rewrite history to move forward. The scars remained, but they no longer dictated her direction. Control had once been used against her. Now, control meant choosing where her energy would no longer go. Her phone buzzed occasionally with messages she didn't open immediately, requests, congratulations, curiosity disguised as concern. She answered when necessary, ignored what wasn't. Silence, once forced on her, became a tool she wielded with intention. She learned that withholding access wasn't cruelty, it was boundary. The same quiet that once kept her small now kept her safe. And in that reversal, she felt a calm satisfaction, not triumph, but alignment, like finally standing upright after years of bending to fit someone else's shadow. Across the city, Kunle's name did not surface in her conversations or considerations. Not because he was forgotten, but because he no longer mattered to the outcomes she was shaping. Absence became its own statement. He waited for retaliation that never came, for a reckoning that required his presence. None arrived. The most painful consequence was being irrelevant to the future she was building. And as weeks passed, that realization sank deeper than any punishment could have, because it confirmed that her life no longer revolved around the damage he had done. As dusk settled over Lagos, the city lights flickered on in careful sequence, mirroring the order she had brought to her own life. Amara closed her folder, decisions made, paths set. She wasn't done growing, no one ever is. But she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Power had found her, and she had chosen what kind it would be. Somewhere behind her, a door remained permanently closed. Ahead, another waited, unmarked and quiet. And with her hand resting calmly at her side, one question lingered. What lesson remains when revenge is refused and the future insists on honesty? Morning arrived gently this time, light stretching across a calm Lagos skyline as Amara stood on a balcony overlooking a city that no longer felt hostile. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain from the night before, and for the first time in a long while, her chest didn't feel tight. There was no rush, no crisis demanding reaction. Just space. Stillness settled around her, not as emptiness, but as proof of survival. The chaos that once defined her life had receded, leaving behind a quiet truth she could finally sit with. Somewhere across the city, Kunle woke each day with words rehearsed in his mind, apologies shaped carefully, regrets sharpened by loss, but none of them found their way to her. Not because he didn't try, but because certain doors close without negotiation. Forgiveness, she understood now, was not a transaction. It didn't require reunion. Closure didn't always come from conversation. Sometimes it arrived through distance and time. What was broken had taught its lesson, and no amount of remorse could return things to what they were. Finality, once accepted, became its own form of peace. She reflected on how easily power disguises itself as entitlement, how quickly love is corrupted when control replaces care. Kunle hadn't started cruel. He had grown cruel by believing he could act without consequence. The slap wasn't just violence, it was a declaration of ownership. And ownership, when applied to people, always ends in loss. The lesson was sharp but necessary. How someone treats you when they believe you have nothing reveals who they truly are. Everything else is performance. Love, she realized, was never meant to be proven through endurance of pain. Strength wasn't silence in the face of harm. It was the courage to leave when staying demanded self-erasure. She thought of others like her, quiet, patient, unseen, carrying stories no one bothered to hear. Her journey wasn't meant to glorify suffering or reward patience blindly. It was meant to expose a truth often ignored. Survival should never require disappearance. Any love that asks you to shrink is not love at all. The community learned its lesson quietly, without speeches or apologies. They learned that laughter can become evidence, that silence can become guilt, that watching harm unfold makes you part of its story. They learned that wealth doesn't create worth, it reveals it. Amara hadn't changed because of money. Money had simply removed the noise that kept people from seeing her clearly. And that realization unsettled them more than any revenge ever could. Her future unfolded without drama. Investments growing steadily, responsibilities expanding, purpose deepening. She built systems that protected others, not monuments to herself. She surrounded herself with people who didn't need her silence to feel strong. Healing didn't mean forgetting the past. It meant refusing to let it dictate tomorrow. Each decision she made carried intention, not reaction. And with every step forward, the version of herself who once stood at that gate faded further into memory. As the sun climbed higher, Amara turned back into her home, closing the balcony door softly behind her. The city continued, indifferent and alive, but she no longer needed its approval. Somewhere, a man lived with regret that could not be redeemed by words. Somewhere else, a woman lived with clarity earned through pain. The story didn't end with reunion or revenge. It ended with truth. And the truth lingered long after the screen would fade. How you treat someone when you think they have nothing is the only apology the future remembers.